It's a really good thing he didn't read the long bio. So, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to join you today and share a few thoughts on this important topic. As Ali mentioned, I'm Mike Gardner. I'm an elected city council member in the city of Riverside. I've been on the Seismic Safety Commission for just about 10 years now. I was first appointed by Governor Schwarzenegger, and I've been reappointed by Governor Brown 2 times, and in fact I'm currently awaiting Senate confirmation on my latest reappointment. The mission of the Seismic Safety Commission is to provide decision makers and the general public with cost-effective recommendations to reduce earthquake losses and speed recovery. The Commission investigates earthquakes, researches earthquake-related issues and reports, and recommends to the Governor and Legislature policies and programs needed to reduce earthquake risk. Most often, when we think of earthquake risk and damage reduction, we focus on the potential loss of life and destruction of buildings and key infrastructure like roads and electric and water and systems. To that end, we've identified a number of building types that are more vulnerable to collapse and strong shaking. We've talked about those under a bunch of different titles, and I will use slightly different ones than some of the others did, but we're talking about 5 basic building types. Unreinforced masonry buildings generally constructed before 1933, the Long Beach earthquake. Soft story or wood frame buildings with open ground level wall lines. These are often apartment buildings built before 1978. Non-ductile concrete buildings built before 1978. Tilt-up buildings built before 1978. These are usually commercial and light industrial big box structures. Warehouses, older grocery stores, things like that. Precast concrete buildings built before 1977. These are largely the older parking structures, but there are others of that construction type. There are other construction types of concern, but these are the ones at the greatest risk of failure. State legislation required local jurisdictions to inventory all unreinforced masonry buildings many years ago. But there are presently no requirements to inventory other at-risk building types. Add to that the fact that the unreinforced masonry building inventories may not have been well maintained by some jurisdictions, and it becomes clear that we do not have a good understanding of how many vulnerable buildings are out there or precisely where they are. Having that knowledge would allow local government to better plan and to make decisions on requiring retrofit or replacement. There is, however, a significant but attached here. The information is important and clearly useful, but it is expensive to acquire, and most local governments are strapped for cash. Balancing this need with the ability to pay for it will require careful coordination between the state and local governments. We talked about unfunded mandates. I know the bill contains some language that would reimburse local agencies for at least some of their costs, but as a local agency person, that is a real issue for almost every local government. Let me turn, though, to a piece of the earthquake risk problem that I feel we do not place sufficient focus on, and that's resiliency, or the ability to resume life after the shaking stops, the rescues are complete, the fire is put out. Here are some areas that concern me greatly. Housing, particularly affordable housing, will be lost in a major earthquake. Remember the soft-story building problem? That's where our low-income folks largely live. If not retrofitted, many of these structures will fail and not be repairable. Where will we house those displaced people? How will they replace everything that they own that is in that failed building? How do we get business back to business? Even with modern building codes, many buildings will not be usable immediately after an earthquake. Our building codes are designed to prevent collapse and save lives, not to ensure that the building is usable or even will survive strong shaking. The Seismic Safety Commission has embarked on a project to better inform the public and building owners of this fact so that people can make educated choices about retrofitting existing buildings and building new ones to a higher standard than the building codes actually require. A resilient building should be worth more when sold, and it should draw higher rent or lease for buildings that are used in that manner. We need to focus on how we can incentivize strengthening of at-risk buildings ahead of an earthquake, and we need to look at how we can speed recovery after an earthquake. Can we speed up the permitting process for building repair and construction of new buildings? Should that be put in place ahead of time or dealt with on an emergency basis after an earthquake? For those businesses that will have to rebuild, how do we convince them to rebuild where they were rather than some other part of California or some other state? Other states are actively recruiting our businesses every day today. Think what may happen to us if they're faced with a long permitting process and costly retrofit or rebuilding of their buildings. We need to plan to help businesses stay here after a disaster. The Commission has been working with the small business community through the small business development centers to help in that effort. We've also been working with Japanese companies with operations in California. And that's a twofold effort. One is to learn from them, their experience in dealing with and recovering from earthquakes in Japan, and to help them understand the differences in what the government will do to help them after an earthquake in California and the United States as compared to what it will do in Japan. In Japan, the government offers much more in the way of resources and funding post-earthquake to help people recover than our governments at the state or national levels, the national level does here. Here's an area where our government can be of more assistance in earthquake recovery. Many individual buildings can and should be retrofitted to better withstand an earthquake. Contents can be secured to reduce hazard, avoid product loss, and cleanup time post-earthquake. New buildings can be designed to be immediately occupiable after an earthquake. These things take time and money, two commodities that are often in short supply. This is challenging because while the risk of a major earthquake is high, the probability one will happen to you tomorrow is very low. So we tend not to focus on it. We need to educate our leaders and the public at large on the need to invest in those things that will help us return to normal as soon as possible after an earthquake. We should explore potential incentives for stronger new construction and retrofit of existing vulnerable buildings. Incentives like investment tax credits, expedited permitting, reduced or waived permit fees, and temporary exemption from some of the environmental regulations can be of major help in that respect. Events like this conference help with the education and awareness effort. I thank you for holding it. I thank you for inviting me here today to share some thoughts with you. And I am available for any questions if you have any. Fire away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may, I'd like to ask the first question.
Please.
Since I am part of the working group for the Seismic Resilience Initiative in leadership of U.S. Resiliency Council, there are a couple of questions that keep coming up and suggestions, okay? One of which is we all recognize the importance of identifying the vulnerable buildings, both for our affordable housing community and for our business community, because a lot of these small businesses that you rightly pointed to probably don't even know that they're at risk, because all they're doing renting a space in a building, and as a business they're trying to reduce their cost, so they're in wherever they can afford, they're in that building. They don't necessarily go and check and find out what type of building it is, or if it is a vulnerable building or not. So on the affordable housing, we understand that the state has almost $6 billion of surplus that currently is considering how to use over and above the rainy fund.
Right.
And so there have been some estimates that USRC and SRI have kind of preliminary estimates. They have identified a $50 million cost of helping the local agencies identify these vulnerable buildings. And the question that we receive often is, that is so small compared to the amount of money in 1 year. That $50 million, Mr. Gardner, is over 5 years, because that cost is not going to be incurred that first year.
Right.
So it seems like this is a very small amount of money. And why wouldn't the state consider that? That's the first question. And the second question is, for infrastructure, for water lines, sewer lines, wastewater treatment plants, and other type of infrastructure, there is currently what is called state infrastructure revolving loan,
Right.
which it was a part of a federal program started many years ago, and in the 80s, and then it was basically collaborated with the states, and now it's a very successful program. The state provides very, very low interest rate loans to private agencies, government, to build these wastewater treatment plants or water lines and other type of infrastructure, amortized over long periods of time, of 40 years. And why couldn't we consider a mechanism like that that doesn't cost the state any money? Because these revolving infrastructure loans, people borrow, pay back, and since the state is not there to make money, they're not there like a bank or another investment company to make money. They want to cover their expenses of providing these monies. So what would happen is initial seed money is funded through a bond program that would be placed in this revolving loan, and it would keep loaning money to different building owners and investors. These are the two questions.
No, I think both are good ideas. And really the conflict is, even though the state has what seems like a lot of money in unallocated reserves at the moment, there is huge competition for those dollars from everything that you can dream of. The Highway Patrol would like more officers and better equipment. Our water system needs, the state water program needs significant upgrades. There's talk about how do we deliver Northern California water to Southern California? How do we reduce impacts on the Delta smelt? Should there be tunnels under the North Bay? Everything you can think of, there's competition for those dollars, and it's up to the legislature and the governor ultimately to allocate those dollars. I think you make good arguments for taking a piece of those dollars, and under the leadership of people like Assemblymember Nazarian, attempts are being made to do that. We'll have to wait and see how the legislature treats that, if they are willing to put it forward, and then if the governor will accept it. It's a two-step process. You have to get something through the legislature, then the governor has to sign it into law. And both can be a challenge, and especially if there's competition or disagreement over that topic. And certainly there's competition for the dollars. Sir?
Unfortunately, Denver Hallways is the only one who was a mayor within our district, in one of our local cities. And prior to the lunch break, he actually talked to me about some of the concerns that he has as mayor of his city in regards to legislation. He says that more than anything, he feels like confused as to like how to navigate the system. And he said, is anything at this point, like a task force, like anything at a local level, we need to establish some sort of system to navigate the system, because it is confusing for like a local mayor, planning commissioner, or just about anybody to navigate this system. So, like, given your background, what recommendations would you make for like local, like city and local governments to begin that navigation process? Like, what would you like say? Like,
there are two things that I think can be useful, specific to earthquake resiliency, and much of that actually is transferable to other sorts of disasters. The Southern California Association of Governments has started an earthquake resiliency program. They've hired Dr. Lucy Jones, who was with USGS, commonly called the Earthquake Lady. We've all seen her on television many times following an earthquake. Her program is one of education about vulnerabilities and resiliency and how local government can work to improve their piece of that picture. So through SCAG is one good way to do it. Another is just more conferences like this. Visit the Seismic Safety Commission's website. There's good information there. If you're trying to figure how you navigate the legislative process, I'm not sure there's anybody who really knows how to do that totally effectively, including legislators and people who get paid to work the system. But talk to your local legislator. They can be very helpful. Yes, sir.
Commissioner, I really like the example that you used for Japan and what Japanese government does for their building. And you mentioned that we need to learn from them to do things here. Now, Seismic Commission. What is the next step for Seismic Commission in this role? We have 2 assembly bills out there. How would you foresee the California Seismic Commission to support these bills, or where does it go from there?
I don't believe the Commission will take an active role in supporting or opposing the legislation. We do have one of our staff who is involved in the committee that is providing technical input. If the legislation passes, and it absolutely has got what I think are really good points. Knowledge is power, and if we know where the vulnerable buildings are and how many there are and where they're concentrated, that allows all of us to plan better, even if we don't get to the point of actual retrofit. Just knowing where they are is helpful. So I think the Commission will be involved in helping design some of the review of buildings. One of the things that we don't talk about much yet is not only, if you're going to do this, not only do you need to do the inventory in the first place, but you have to keep up with it. You have to update the database as time goes on. And in my own city, Riverside, we, way back when, went out and did our unreinforced masonry building inventory like we were supposed to do, and we told people, you have to put up the placard if you don't retrofit it. We haven't followed up on it. We have not got a good inventory of how many unreinforced masonry buildings still exist in our city. We know that many have been upgraded, many have been replaced, but we don't have a really accurate count, and we ought to. And we don't have a count of the other vulnerable building types. We would like to have that. Just a real rough estimate from our building official is that's going to cost us $100,000 just for the rough inventory. We don't have staff with the time to do that. Most local agencies don't. So that's consultant work, and it's a somewhat limited field of talent to do that work. And that's why the $50 million is over 5 years, because there aren't sufficient people to do the work in 1 year, even if you said go and you said, here's a pot of money to do it with. It's going to take time to get this done. You guys are easy on me. It's much easier than a council meeting. Yes, sir.
So I don't have a microphone, so I'm going to project. Observation. What we're doing today is noble. I'm Kevin Harvard with this. It's noble and it's necessary. The practical part is implementation. Gentleman here talked about residential, also commercial. We know that the cost of retrofitting is going to be a derivative, a smaller percentage of the appreciation in today's real estate market of these buildings. So return on investment will be swift. The grants are going to be finite. You got to get the legislation through. But the practical part comes into identifying a list of financiers who can make this easy once this legislation and this bill is enforced or is in place. So what I want to ask is there a way to put together a roster of companies that will provide financing for these commercial financiers to get the retrofits done in a way that can be amortized over 10, 15, 20, 30 years? That's my question, because once it gets done, right, the legal part, how do we implement it and get people to comply? And I think that's a critical component.
And that really makes sense. It depends to some extent on whose building is it. Some entities have bonding capability, others don't. They have to go get a conventional loan somewhere. Mr. Sahabi suggested something along the line of the water and sewer infrastructure retrofit program, where the state sells a bond and loans the money out, and the loan payments then service the bond. So it is a revolving fund. Something like that would make sense. Trying to pull that all together would be helpful. That's another one where you create the database, but if you don't maintain it, it quickly becomes outdated and maybe even more harmful than useful. But depending on the sort of building owner that you are, you may be able to wander off to your friendly local bank and get a real estate loan at a favorable rate, or you may not. In my own city, in Riverside, many of our vulnerable building types are located in downtown, particularly the unreinforced masonry buildings. They're concentrated in Riverside's downtown. We go back to the 1880s. So there's a lot of older construction in the city of Riverside. Many of those buildings are owned by old Riverside families, and our downtown, up until maybe 10 years ago, we are a justice and a legal center and a government center. So at 5 o'clock, they rolled up the sidewalks, everybody went home, and nothing happened downtown. In the last 10 years, our downtown has started to revitalize. Property values are going up, and it is worth investing in a building in our downtown today, when 10 years ago it probably wasn't. And there was real fear, and one of the reasons Riverside did not mandate retrofit of unreinforced masonry buildings was the council at that time knew that building owners would walk on their buildings. They were paid for, they brought in some revenue, but not a lot. Nobody wanted to put a lot of capital into the building, and if they had been told, fix it, there were a number that would have said no and just left. Then the jurisdiction is faced with dealing with an abandoned building in an area that they're trying to revitalize. So it's always a careful balance to try to make these things work. I think as a whole, California is in a better position to do these things today than we were 10 or 20 years ago. So the economy is favorable at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.